I would tell myself to not underestimate the human connection you can make with someone. I came into the Navy, again, thinking of it from the authoritarian mindset. I'm the senior officer in my division. This is my authority. This is my responsibility. So I will execute, our job and tasking and whatnot accordingly. But as I've alluded to over the course of our conversation, I think I would go back and tell myself to put those things aside and establish a better human-to-human relationship with the people that worked for me.
The ability to learn from your mistakes and the mistakes of others can be the make or break of any successful leader. For this third and final episode in our very short little series of interviews with veterans, I'm joined by Anthony LaVopa. He is an active duty US naval officer, so we've stepped out to sea after our last two conversations with Army veterans. He's also a leadership coach in his spare time, as you do. With over 15 years of military service behind him, including the command of a US Navy warship, Anthony now helps others learn from his failures and his stumbles to better themselves both as professionals and as people. He guides people through their leadership development journey to their optimal leadership potential and helps them achieve a legacy that is both purpose-driven and intentional. Today we'll be talking about all of the various intersections, similarities and differences in leadership approaches between his experience in the Navy and military life and how it compares to life in the private sector, in a business, in a small company or startup. And we'll also be talking through some of the key lessons that we can take. So there's plenty of wisdom to be had in this episode, especially if you are a new leader, a first-time manager, maybe a first-time company founder, and you're looking for a bit of help, support, knowledge, wisdom about leadership. If that does sound like you, and you haven't done so already, I do encourage you to head over to www.leadernotaboss.com. There you can subscribe to my newsletter, and by doing so, you will very shortly afterwards receive an invitation to join my Integrity Leaders online community, where we offer all sorts of added extras to help you along with your own leadership journey, whether that be monthly live sessions where we'll focus in on one particular aspect of leadership. Well, that's enough from me. Let's get Anthony on the show.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Anthony, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us on the podcast today. It's great to have you. Welcome to Leading with Integrity.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you on the show. And we'll kick things off by really just handing the reins over to you for a bit to introduce yourself to the listeners, tell us a bit about your illustrious background and what you get up to today. What gets you out of bed in the morning?
Yeah, so I appreciate the opportunity to be here and chat. I definitely would not qualify my career as illustrious at this point, but I've been an active duty naval officer for just about 15 years. Graduated in 2009 from Virginia Tech with a bachelor's in engineering, and just been really enjoying it. I've got the opportunity to see a lot of interesting things in interesting places. I've had the privilege to work with some really great people, and just really enjoy it.
Fair enough. Well, I mean, illustrious is relative, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So let's talk then about your time in the Navy. What are some of your most memorable experiences from your time in service?
Certainly the beginning of my career, starting anything new, I think is always memorable. And my first two deployments were back in 2009 and 2011 to the Horn of Africa area, where we were doing counter-piracy operations when that was kind of big at the time. But I'd say overall, my most memorable moments up to this point is having been in command I commanded USS Hurricane, a coastal patrol craft. We were forward deployed, home ported in Bahrain, and just really enjoyed my time there. I had an amazing crew. Got to take command of the ship while we were still in the dry dock, and so got to experience command from seeing the ship up on blocks and having to kind of start at square one from the training and building teams and kind of going through all the certification phase to be able to actually, take the ship out and deploy operationally to go do operations in support of U.S. Fifth Fleet. So that for me was definitely the most memorable sets of things I've been able to do so far.
And is that quite rare that you get to command the ship right from the start, almost as it's finishing being built, or is that an unusual experience? I don't know. So
I would say it's not unusual. I would say it's more unusual that as a lieutenant commander, I had command. Typically in the Navy, command is held at the O5 or the commander level. So it's unusual that I had command of a smaller ship as an O4, but that's something that I wanted to go do. And so I kind of took myself off of the normal career path, so to speak, to go do that. And I'm really happy that I did. It's not uncommon to take over the ship at various parts in its life cycle. There's the maintenance time, there's the operational time, there's the training time, and really the change of command just kind of occurs where sometimes we would like to hope it occurs in a natural break between one cycle, but more often than not, it just happens to be more based on the timing of the captain that's departing, the timing of the captain that's arriving, and we just kind of just work through it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like, to equate it to the business world, it's almost like the startup phase, I suppose, isn't it? Because it's such a new entity, whether it's a ship or a company.
Yeah, there is for sure, and the new construction side is completely different. My time on DDG 1000, USS Zumwalt, we were built up in Bath, Maine at Bath Iron Works. So I arrived when the ship was still in construction, and then about 4 months later we left, and the ship was done, and we took the ship around through the Panama Canal to San Diego, and so that was a whole completely different and unique experience for me. I had never done new construction before. And as you said, it's a little bit akin to a startup in that, you're kind of establishing all of the Navy programs that you would normally just walk into on another ship. And in this ship, it was, okay, great. Now we need to have a safety program. Okay, well, how do we do that? Go grab the instruction, figure out how to do it. What things apply to this ship specifically that may not apply to ships that we've all served on previously. And so you're right. There is a startup element to the new construction phase for sure. And
one of the most, for a lot of people anyway, the most exciting aspects of a startup is being able to build your team and hire in that exciting talent. Is there an equivalence there? How much say does the commander of a ship have over who ends up crewing it?
That's a really good question. So unfortunately, it's not exactly like that. There is some additional requirements that sailors have to get screened for in order to go to a pre-commissioning unit. Typically, the level of talent that goes to a pre-commissioning unit is a little bit higher because, again, you are kind of in that sort of startup phase, and so you need that little boost. But ultimately, it's no different than every other ship, right? You need X amount of people, and there's only Y amount of people available. And so, personnel decisions have to be made about where people can go, et cetera. So it's not quite like a startup in that, the CEO of the ship gets to send his or her, wish list or dream list to the personnel folks and say, hey, here's the team that I want to hire to bring to the ship. But, there definitely is some, additional thought put into the folks that get to a pre-commissioning unit.
How closely involved do you get in the actual, it's not hiring, is it? They're already hired, but in the, let's call it the recruitment, maybe? I don't know. Selection.
I think the right word. So from the officer perspective, there's a little bit more conversation that can happen in terms of which officers are going to come to the pre-commissioning unit. But in general, I would say it's in line with how we do officer detailing and placement throughout the Navy. As a lieutenant, you get your list of, ships or your slate sent to you of, hey, I want to do this job in this home port. You generally will tell the personnel folks, I really want to go to a destroyer, and it doesn't really matter to me where that destroyer is, or I really want to be an operations officer or a chief engineer, and I don't care what kind of ship. And so you help the personnel folks in terms of giving them your priorities and the things that you want. And then, XOs and COs get a chance to weigh in as well. Typically when we have officers that depart the ship and they are wanting to go somewhere and they're looking for their next set of orders, the captain of the ship gets to weigh in, and say, yes, I think this person would be great for this job, or maybe they'd be better suited to go do something else. And so that, I think, is always a healthy dialogue to kind of help the personnel folks gauge, we understand what this person looks like on paper, but from a day-to-day perspective, personality and such, where are they best suited, and how do we best use their talent for the Navy?
So it sounds like walking the line between having the full control and having to accept whatever you're given.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There is an element of kind of just taking your hands off the steering wheel, right? There's a process in place. It's been the same process for a while. Over time, there are, I would say small course corrections that get made on the type of folks that we want to send to a ship or what specific qualifications we're looking for. But in general, the process has been relatively unchanged. And I think that's kind of the leadership portion at the command level, is how do you take the variance of talent that you get, both in the officer and the enlisted side. And as a leader, how do you mold that and bring those people into the fold and say, hey, welcome to our ship. This is our culture. These are the standards we have. We'd like for you to get on board. How can we help you, et cetera? And I think that's kind of where, the leadership part takes over. Where I think kind of from the personnel perspective, and I'm not a personnel person. That's not my background or specialty, but I think there's an underlying expectation that you kind of bloom where you're planted, as one of my previous captains would say. And so, yes, maybe you didn't get your first choice, or you did get your first choice. But wherever you go, you have something to offer. You have talent that's valuable. You're certainly a valuable member of the crew to do, large scale events, and evolutions. And so again, I think, the most important thing from a leadership perspective is, one, recognize that that person coming to you is value added, because you actually have a person, and it's not, a gap that you need to fill or someone you don't have. But then from the person that's showing up, show up with that mentality of, I'm going to bloom where I planted. Maybe I'm going to get to do what I originally thought, or maybe there's something completely different that the command is going to ask me to do that I never would have thought about, but turns out I'm going to really enjoy doing it.
Quite a good way of looking at it as well, I think. And I think the private sector could maybe benefit from that sort of mindset on occasion, particularly lately when you hear quite a lot of business leaders decrying the talent shortage and that kind of issue with the Great Resignation and so on. So, yeah, I think that's quite an enlightened view to take on it.
It's a really interesting point. I mean, I work with people in the private sector. I do coaching and help people work through communication, strategic thinking. And that is definitely a trend. And I've found that some of the people I work with have a very narrow vision of what they want the people on their team to do, or what they want them to be. And I've encouraged those folks to kind of just take a step back and understand the person as a whole. And then kind of tangential to that, look at your hiring process and what are you hiring for? Are you advertising by saying we need, this job and this job description, or are you advertising and looking for someone with this skill set or this talent or this personality? Right. And so I think there's many ways to match, talent and personality and skill set to a job. And arguably if you're going to hire somebody and they're willing to walk through the door and say, hey, this is my background. This is what I've done. This is the skill set I have. How can I apply it? I think that's incredibly powerful to an organization to have the flexibility to say, hey, we can move this person around, or we could do what we need with this person, because they're willing to learn and be adaptable. I think when you kind of start trying to pigeonhole people into a particular role and then just kind of, put them in a box and you tell them stay in that box. I think that's some poor leadership and not allowing that person to be innovative and contribute to the rest of the team. But two, I think it makes that individual feel incredibly frustrated in terms of, well, this is the box. I have to stay in the box. And then I think they go from an employee that could be potentially excited with a lot of ability to add value to an employee that quickly becomes frustrated, disgruntled, and then kind of just turns inward and just, comes to work, does what they need to do, and then goes home.
Absolutely. And I think that's especially pertinent in the smaller businesses, the startups, the ones where sometimes the pace of change is rapid, and so they need that flexibility. But as you say, if you put someone in the box, then sooner or later they'll maliciously stay in that box.
Sure.
If you know what I mean. So when you need them to be flexible, they won't. And yeah, it's an interesting one. It reminds me of that truism about the perfect being the enemy of the good as well. We hear it a lot in terms of work and output and product, but I think it applies to your hiring as well. There's quite a few business leaders I've seen over the years as well, where they just hold out for that perfect candidate and surprisingly never find them. So the job goes unfilled.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Perfect is the enemy of good enough, whether it's people or projects or outcomes or products or, and I don't even want to look back over the amount of time in my career that I've stood, with the same PowerPoint slide and change a couple things, go back, change it again, and just kind of in this endless pursuit of, what does the perfect PowerPoint slide look like? And to be honest, I don't know what perfect actually means from that perspective, because perfect is different things to different people. To me, something that can communicate clearly what it is that you're trying to say, if it's a presentation or a product or something, and that's what you're working on, does it communicate what you're trying to communicate? And is the person receiving the communication either, auditory or visual or et cetera, are they getting the message that you're trying to give them, or are they getting something else? And so to me, that's more of a measure of success rather than, getting overly involved with the perfection of the product. It's not to say that attention to detail is not important, but there comes a point of diminishing returns where now you or your team are focused on the final 5% and it's eating up 90% of your day when, in all honesty, maybe 90% is a good enough product, or 95% is a good enough product. One of the things in command that I tried to do was not waste people's time and to not create inefficiencies. And so I remember the first few briefs and presentations that people did, again, very focused on format and slideology and things like that. And finally, I just got to the point I said, I don't want any formatting. I want to see white slides with black letters, and that's it, because I want you to focus on the message you're trying to communicate and not get overwhelmed and distracted by fancy graphics or pictures or, is this bullet 5 spaces, to the right of that bullet, or, now that doesn't mean commit egregious formatting and make the slide look disorganized. But what I tried to do is get people to understand that the PowerPoint or the handout is a product, right? And the product is important, but what's more important is the outcome of what it is that you're trying to do. And from a communication standpoint, and one of the things I've often talked to people in the private sector about is it's about communicating in a way that you're reaching everyone's learning style, right? Some people like to read. Some people like to close their eyes and listen. Some people like pictures and diagrams. So when you create a product and you're in a meeting or you're giving a briefing to someone, you've got to ensure as the person delivering the message that you're covering as many of those learning styles as you can. And when you start to distract people by graphics and too much text on the slide or, things like that, then it becomes a negative return, and people walk out of that meeting and they go, I don't understand what that person was trying to communicate because the slide was just so full of words and I just felt so overwhelmed in trying to read all of them and listen at the same time. So, that was one of my lessons learned from command was keep things simple, and focus on the message being delivered more than the product. There is a time, I think, to focus on product and product development, but I think in general, most organizations spend too much time on the product and they lose sight of the purpose of the product, which is to drive to a decision or just to drive to an outcome.
Yes. I mean, the PowerPoint example in particular, I think is a great one for the downsides of technology. Sometimes it can do too many things on occasion that we don't really need it to do when there's just that one central purpose you need it for. Slideology as well. Love that word. That's my new word for the day. Thank you. How would you define then a high performing team, which seems pretty relevant given your career background? And what advice would you offer listeners who are maybe trying to create one?
I think those are really good questions. I don't know that I've figured out the answers yet, but what I will say is, to me, a high performing team is one that is, first off, it's functioning, right? It's a well-oiled machine. It's got good communication. So people on the team know how to communicate across the team, but they also know how to communicate down to the people who are doing more work, but perhaps at a different level. And they also know how to communicate up to explain what it is that the team is doing and how the goal or outcome or objective is being met based on, higher guidance. So I think that's communication is the first piece. The second piece I would say is they're innovative. And so rather than kind of having a recipe card of this is how we do things, okay, we get the next goal or objective or whatnot. And, we're just going to take what we did last time and do the same thing and change some words. And, that can be effective for certain things. I don't necessarily think that's a good process. And a lot of times I've found when you talk about process with people, they think it's a very organized, repeatable, set of events where, things are done in series. And when you're done with one thing, you go to the next thing. I would say that is a type of process. But I would say that the process of a high performing team or high functioning team is that they're able to do multiple things in parallel at the same time. And that is enabled by, the communication, but it's also enabled by innovation. And I think the third major thing is it's enabled by delegation, right? The leaders of those teams, are giving their thoughts, giving kind of, okay, here's the goal or here's the outcome. Here's kind of some checkpoints along the way of where we can all get back together and we can review what we have to determine, do we have the right metrics to measuring success? Are we on track to meet our goal? Is the goal unachievable? And so I think that the delegation, communication, and innovation, I think in my mind is kind of what drives, those high performing teams. I'm a New England Patriots fan. It's not been a great last few seasons, but I think of the Bill Belichick, model or the Tom Brady quote of do your job. Right. And so, Bill Belichick was as a fantastic coach and because he's got a winning record, but it's not the winning record that made him fantastic. It's his leadership style and communication style to his offensive coaches, his defensive coaches, his special teams coaches to say, this is what I expect these teams to be able to do when we bring everyone together in a game. And this is how I want the team to function in a game and how we want to operate. And these are the key players that are going to drive, the outcome or the performance of the team. And so I think when you have somebody with that mindset, it's hard to not become a high performing team or a high functioning team because the team itself is actually doing the work and the leaders of that team get an opportunity to take a step back and just watch the magic happen from the innovation, communication, and the delegation piece.
No, that's interesting. And one aspect of that I'd like to pick up on, which is, I think it's a subset of communication really, but it's about the expectations, isn't it? So setting them and managing them and making sure everyone has the same understanding of them. And I think what would be particularly interesting, actually, given your military background and the perspective and the perception from outside of that is often, and you use the word delegation as well, that it's more about, the hierarchy and whoever above you is making the decisions. That's it. You do as you're told. You don't think. How much of that is fair and unfair? And how does that sit with this communication piece about sharing and managing those expectations, which really realistically needs to happen in both directions?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So I think the military sometimes gets a bad rap or a bad reputation in that, it's a very, again, things are done in series. Somebody gives an order, the next person gives the same order, and it just kind of goes down the line. I've not had that typically be my experience. And this is where I often have the conversation with people about confusing leadership and authority. As you get more senior in the military, you gain more authority. You have the ability to direct more people to do things. You have different types of commanders, et cetera. But I've found from my career that the best leaders are able to kind of put the authority piece aside because that's already established, right? When I had command of Hurricane, my boss was a captain in 2006, and his boss was a 3-star admiral. So there was no lack of clarity or ambiguity that I was, an 2004 lieutenant commander, and I worked for somebody that had more authority, and he worked for somebody that had way more authority. So I think once you can put that authority piece aside and you can begin to have a conversation with somebody from a leadership perspective, there's ways to do that. One, in the military to maintain the decorum and respect and whatnot that we show people that are senior in rank, but still able to have open communication. And I remember a few times in command calling my boss. I had 2 bosses, depending on the situation. And sometimes, I would call one and say, "Hey, sir, I understand what it is that you're trying to do. And here's why I don't agree that we should do it this way. Or here's why I think maybe this is a better objective than the one that you gave me." And I would say more often than not, the response that I would normally get was, "Hey, that's a great idea." Or, "Hey, you're right. Let's shift to going to do this." Sometimes you do get the answer back of, "Hey, look, this is what we need to go do. And we're not changing it, and, go forward and do good things." Okay. Got it. But again, I've found that even in times where you are being directed to go do something, and I would say those are few and far between, because in the Navy, we generally give commanders a pretty good amount of latitude to interpret what their boss is looking for. And I would say the best leaders are still able to have that conversation. And rather than clarifying the objective, because the objective or the goal or the outcome is understood, I would say the best leaders are able to communicate why we're pursuing that objective or the goal. And so, Simon Sinek, I'm a huge fan. If you're watching, thank you very much. But he talks a lot about understanding your why as a leader. And I fully endorse that thought. And I also think it's really important to understand your why as an organization. And I think that's probably another piece to the high performing, high functioning that I didn't talk about, is everybody on that team understands why they're there and why what they're trying to accomplish is important. From the ship perspective, as a commanding officer or a captain, you have to explain that why sometimes, because the why is easily lost in translation. We're going to do this specific task. A lot of times why is dependent on things like pay grade or job type or level of experience or whether or not it applies to them. And so when you take all those different whys that are out there, the job of a leader is to reorient the organization on the overall why, the big why. Hey, we need to go do this underway replenishment, and we're going to do it at 2:00 in the morning. Why? Here's all the reasons. And then here's why we're not doing it, at these other times of the day. So yes, it seems inconvenient, but this makes the most sense based on these set of circumstances, as an example. The other piece I think that's important with why is for leaders to be able to, again, communicate across, but communicate up and down, right? And the challenge that I see, or I talk to with many people, is the inability to translate very strategic ideas that come out of the C-suite into kind of middle management speak, and then translate those into kind of production level, worker level, details and understanding. And so there's very, the C-suite or, very senior officers in the Navy use very strategic level words and thinking and buzz phrases. And those typically don't really mean anything to very junior enlisted sailors or junior officers. They know the buzzwords or the buzz phrases, but they don't actually understand what they mean. And so it's kind of that middle management, mid-level leadership. It's really important for that person to be able to take those strategic concepts and translate them in a meaningful way to their team, so their team can understand the why. And again, I think that is probably one of the most challenging pieces about leadership. But going back to the question you asked, I think the best leaders in the military and the best organizations in the military can acknowledge the fact that there's a rank structure, and rank comes with different levels of authority and different levels of responsibility. But authority and responsibility don't necessarily equate to being a leader, right? You can have a lot of authority in any organization and not be a good leader. And you can have very little authority in an organization and be a fantastic leader. And all of the ships I've been on, I can think of junior enlisted sailors who would not call themselves a leader because they're junior, they're not an officer, whatever, self-induced reason they've given themselves of why they're not a leader. But you know what? That guy or gal was the go-to person on the ship for this thing, which in my mind says that person's a leader in their field because they understand their trade or their craft or their job, and they understand the why it's important. So long answer to a short question, but I think whether it's military or not, it's important for leaders to separate out authority and responsibility from actually leading people.
I completely agree with that. Definitely. I think, especially your story there about the more junior sailors, I think there's, in any organization, there's always those people who are perceived as low in the organization, but actually every day they're exhibiting leadership behaviors, whether it's the way they're just building up their colleagues, offering help where it's needed without having to be asked. There's all kinds of everyday behaviors that people do without realizing and would never think of themselves as leaders, but practically that's what they are. And that's a really interesting part of leadership to me as well.
I think, I also tell people a lot that leadership is not a title, it's a mindset, right? You be in your first job, coming out of school or whatnot, and you're day one, and you may not have experience in that field, or you may not have tenure or time with that company or organization or team, but that doesn't mean you can't be a leader from day one. And so it's a mindset to me. It's not a title. And I think we've all been part of organizations where somebody was quote unquote the leader of a team, but in actuality, everybody on that team went to someone else for advice, feedback, whatever it may be. And then the person that was the actual designated leader was just the recipient of a product or a meeting or a briefing. And so I think that, that's universal, I think, between the military and the private sector.
Yes, indeed. And so on the subject of leadership then, tell us a bit more about your work as a leadership coach. How did you get into that, and what kind of people do you work with?
So I've been theoretically a leadership coach for the last 15 years, as a naval officer. I enjoy mentoring other officers. I enjoy mentoring sailors. And for me, it's the people, and the opportunity to lead and that's kept me in the Navy. I've certainly got to do some fun things. I've gotten to see some great places, but it's ultimately the people, that have kept me here. And so it was kind of just a natural, I just kind of started getting on LinkedIn and kind of started just talking to people, and found that just through having some conversations with people in the private sector, they would often ask me similar questions to what you're asking me. Hey, how in the military do you handle this? Or, how would you handle this in the private sector if you were working for this company, or if you were in my shoes? And so it kind of just evolved from there. I kind of do it just on a limited basis. Obviously, I, have a full-time job, as an officer, but I really enjoy just talking to people about their experience and helping them. I'm working with a young lady right now. And she's been at the same company for a number of years. She kind of feels like she's hit a glass ceiling. And so she's, trying to understand her leadership style and her communication style, and how she can, adapt those things to be, more successful as a leader, and kind of break out again, kind of get out of that box a little bit, or to see what other opportunities are there for her outside of her company. And so a lot of it is just talking to people, trying to help them organize their thoughts of where they are as a person, as an employee, where they want to be, what does the difference between those two things look like, and then just help them realize they have a lot of leadership potential, and they have a lot of leadership ability. And oftentimes it's very much a self-sabotaging mindset in terms of, oh, I could never do that, or I could never be a good leader, or I could never do what this person does. And in actuality, you can. One of the other things that I found, both in the military and the private sector, is many people will read a lot of leadership books, and they can have a lot of leadership quotes and tell people what they learned in a book. And that's good. It's good to read about leadership. It's good to read about other leadership styles and successes and failures and all that. But it's another thing to take those ideas or those experiences and put them into practice to help mold you, change your leadership style. And I don't think that your leadership style as a person is just you do it, you figure out your style one time and then you move on. And I often tell the people as a young lieutenant, when I started my first department head tour, I was coming back to sea duty. I was really excited. I was confident, in what I was doing, but I was a very, fiery kind of fire and brimstone young lieutenant. I'm genetically Italian, so I can get riled up easily. And so that was a little bit of my leadership style. One of the captains that I worked for was very opposite in terms of personality wise. He was always very calm, cool, and collected. He would often say, his phrase to people when people would start to get excited he would just say, breathe through your nose. And it sounds kind of silly. But when you think about it in practicality, it's like, okay, there's some merit to that. And I kind of observed his personality that way. And I observed how constant it was through various events, things where I would have interpreted and thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be so painful, and he was just very, consistent as a leader. And so it took me a while to kind of be able to digest that and modify my leadership style to the point where I was able to not be so excitable all the time and take things a little bit in stride, better. So that's one example I give people all the time of how, you can learn from the people around you, but you've got to be willing to accept that you could be better, and you've got to be willing to make that change.
It's good advice, definitely. And as is the breathing one as well. It always amazes me how just a simple physiological thing like that can make such a change to your, maybe not a mental state, but certainly your mood in the moment and your reactions to things. It's, really good bit of advice, that one. I've heard it a few times now, so it must be good.
Well, I think, it's, I have two kids, and, one of the things that, my wife and I tell them, and they're almost 3 and almost 6, when they get very excited, it's like, hey, just calm down, take a deep breath. Right. And so all those things that we tell our kids that as adults, sometimes we forget to do, or like at my daughter's school, they have the cool down couch. And when you kind of get a little too excited, you go to the cool down couch and you read a book for a few minutes and relax. And that's one of those things I think as an adult, like if somebody just looked at me and said, hey, you should go to the cool down couch, or you should take a deep breath. We don't say it to each other as adults, but we're super mindful of what we tell our kids. And consequently, our kids are just absorbing everything around them. And so, the other day we were out and I forget what happened. And, we're in the car and like there's traffic or whatever. And I started getting a little frustrated. And, my son was like, Dad, just take a deep breath, calm down. It's okay. And so it's like, all right, you're right. I need to follow my own advice.
Yeah. I was going to say, it's always good when you get your own words thrown back at you, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the other one from when I was a kid that I remember, there were two. One is probably a bit no good anymore, was the naughty step. That's probably not a thing anymore for a good reason. But the other one was when you get angry or start losing your temper, you just stop and count to 10. And again, it's really simple, but it works. And we lose that as adults, I think. Probably would still work.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes, overreaction can be even more damaging than the actual event, itself, and I remember early in my career, it was kind of a badge of pride in the surface warfare community to kind of be somebody who could yell on the bridge and be very excitable and very directive. And then after a while, we realized that people just kind of tune out that style of communication and leadership. And, when I had command, there was only 2 times I remember going to the bridge and really kind of getting a little bit excited. And they were both, kind of times where we needed to kind of pull our heads back together and focus on what was going on, or we were going to get somebody hurt. And so from that perspective, my crew saw like, hey, the captain really got excited about this, and he's normally, pretty calm and, willing to have a dialogue. And so I think when you have the ability to be rather constant, like the captain that I learned from, and then you do get excited, that in itself causes people to say, okay, something must be really wrong if the person who's normally very, constant and cool as a cucumber is now starting to get excited. And I think it makes people tune in to a very high degree, because now they're super interested in why this individual is spun up or excited. And so I think, that can be healthy too.
Yes. It reminds me of a former boss I had, not so much in the getting excitable, but in the sense of everything was urgent. Everything had to be done right away because the boss was the one asking for it. And you're right. If you don't have the contrast, then it's very difficult as the follower rather than the leader to actually discern what actually is urgent, what actually does need your attention immediately, if you're always told everything is. And it's kind of the same dynamic, I think.
Yeah. I think, I'm a huge proponent of the Eisenhower matrix, to help kind of organize the things that are important and not. And, I think when sometimes I tell people just do a brain dump, right? Get a blank piece of paper, write down all of the things that you think you need to do. And then once you do that, get the Eisenhower matrix out and just go item by item and say, where does this thing fall? Is it in the not important, not urgent category? Okay, then write it down in that box. And then when you see, of the 20 things that I wrote down during my brain dump, and there's only 2 that are in the important and urgent box, that tells you something about how you're prioritizing, and you're getting stressed out about 50% or more of the things that, not that they're not important, but they're just not important right now, and they're nice to do's. And so you're right. We've all worked for people where everything must be done right now. Everything is urgent. Everything is the priority. The problem with that is then nothing becomes the priority, right? It becomes squirrel tasking, squirrel or shiny object syndrome. this is important. Now this is important. Now this is important. And it really wears people down, I think, from, the boss is walking down the hallway. You know what that means? Like our priority is about to change, even though we just started this other priority, 25 minutes ago. And so the Eisenhower matrix for me is a way that I've always just tried to organize the things that I need to do versus the things that I want to do versus, why am I even thinking about this? It's not important. It's not urgent. It doesn't even need to be done. But, as humans, I think we just get into, our brain is so impressive at so many things. And sometimes, we need to purposefully help it data dump some of the things that it's thinking or holding on to, because it's just taking up space for brain power resources that we need to do other things.
Indeed. Yeah. I found as well that the other problem it created is nothing ever got finished because, as exactly as you say, you hear him coming or her. And that whatever it is you're halfway through isn't getting done now because there's something else that's about to go to the top of the pile. But,
that's right.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit more about leadership then. So, biggest leadership lesson that you've learned in your career so far, if you had to pick one?
I think the biggest leadership lesson I've learned is not to underestimate the human connection that you can make with people on your team. When I was in command, I had a crew of 25. It was an all-male crew. It was kind of unique. I had the opportunity to get to know people on a much more personal level than in previous ships where my department was 120 sailors or 80 sailors. And so I took full advantage of that to try and understand them as people, learn about their families, their kids, their strengths and their areas of improvement from a leadership and work perspective. And, I found that helped me communicate a lot of times the why something was important and how I could communicate it to them. And I often found that using personal examples or personal reasons for doing things were much more effective in getting people to understand why what we're doing is important. Hey, we need to go do this thing. And when we successfully finish this, we're going to have, a 3-day weekend instead of a 2-day weekend. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a huge motivator for a crew who either has family there and they want to spend time with their family, or they're a single sailor and they just would like to have a few days off from work. So I felt like establishing that human connection with people was something that I really strived to do in command. It's something that I didn't learn until later in my career. I'd say I was kind of a very senior lieutenant or junior lieutenant commander in my department head time. But again, I've been fortunate to have great mentors to learn from. And I would say that's probably the second leadership lesson that I'll throw in there is have good mentors. I've been really, really lucky with the people who I've worked for that have become mentors, or people that I've known through other peers or colleagues and have had a chance to meet. And those mentors have been invaluable to me when I needed good advice. And in command, I often picked up the phone and would call one or two of them and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. This is why I think it's important, or this is why I want to do it. And, number one, as a mentor, they would just listen and hear me out. They would ask a number of questions, and then sometimes they would offer their perspective, or sometimes just through the questions they were asking, I could tell they were helping me to, kind of guide me in a specific area. Either what I wanted to do was a good idea, or it wasn't, or maybe there's, kind of some solution in the middle. So I would say establish that human connection with the people that work for you, and have good mentors and use your mentors.
Both great lessons, definitely. The first one I think is the way you've explained it is really good, because I think everyone who reads a little bit about leadership will know the importance of getting to know your people. But I think taking that next step of why is it important to get to know your people? And I think the reason you've given there is probably the top one. It's because it helps you better explain things and communicate with them if you can understand where they're coming from and meet them there. And I think that's something that perhaps we lose sight of occasionally.
Well, I think it's important to understand that, the purpose, that organizations thrive around purpose and not products. And, Simon Sinek again talks about that in his book, The Infinite Game. And really it's how are you driving your organization for a purpose rather than to just produce a thing. And he uses, in his book, he uses multiple examples, but it's not that Apple's purpose was to create the iPhone or the Apple Watch. It's that they wanted to, bring technology to everyone in the world and make life easier for people every day. And that's much more, human friendly. It's much easier to understand, and it helps people to understand that why much better, rather than just saying, okay, we're all going to get together and we're going to build this phone, and it's kind of a computer, but it's kind of a phone, and people are going to carry it around. After a little bit, people are kind of looking around like, well, I don't want that. I don't want to carry a computer around in my pocket all day and have, email access and all these things 24 hours. But if you were to tell somebody, hey, our purpose here is to make life easier for everybody through technology, that's kind of a hard point to argue with, right? And so I think that's the challenge, especially in the Navy, is how do you communicate the purpose of your organization to your sailors, to your command? What's important to you? Why is it important? It's different captains explain it differently. But for me, the obligation of wanting to serve only goes so far, because everybody in the Navy is a volunteer. So there's that level of appreciation, but then there has to be something more, right? Just the volunteer portion doesn't carry the day. And so it's up to that captain or commanding officer of a ship or a unit, a squadron, whatever it may be, to help that command and that organization find its purpose in the bigger purpose, right? The Navy at large has a purpose based on our Constitution and national security, and again, very large strategic level themes. But again, those themes don't always translate down to smaller units. And so if you are to just walk into your morning meeting with a number of junior sailors and talk strategic concepts, that doesn't, they will probably give you the nod and, okay, yes, sir, we got it. But they're more interested in how does it apply to them, or why are we doing this, or how does our ship fit into the bigger purpose? And I think that is the challenge of leadership and communication is taking those big ideas and helping your organization drive to a purpose.
Yes. And I think that's another one where it's fairly universal. I'd go so far as to say that's the real knack of successful leadership, is being able to communicate to people where their specific role, their contribution fits inside that big organization level strategy. It's something everyone struggles with, I think, at one point or another in their careers.
Definitely.
If you could go back in time to the start of your career, what advice would you give to your younger self?
That's a really good question. I think I would tell myself to not underestimate the human connection you can make with someone. I came into the Navy, again, thinking of it from the authoritarian mindset. I'm the senior officer in my division. This is my authority. This is my responsibility. So I will execute, our job and tasking and whatnot accordingly. But as I've alluded to over the course of our conversation, I think I would go back and tell myself to put those things aside and establish a better human to human relationship with the people that worked for me. Now, I was lucky early in my career. I had a fantastic division. Every single one of those people in my division, I still maintained communication with. Now they're all senior chiefs and warrant officers, and they've gone on to do incredible things. So I got lucky in that they were incredibly mentoring for me as a brand new officer. But that would be the advice I'd go give myself is don't underestimate that human connection, and let your people see you as a human, and not necessarily just as their boss or just as a leader, in sort of a robotic fashion.
Yeah, that's a good piece of advice. I'd probably give my younger self something very similar, because I think maybe it's something about the impetuousness of youth or something, but I think a lot of early leaders, I mean, I know I made that mistake as well. You view that relationship as almost a kind of a binary one, isn't it? They're either going to do as they're told or not, and nothing else matters. And it's, yeah, do as they're told even is not a pleasant phrase either.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So really important lesson, definitely.
Leadership heroes.
Last question I have for you then. This is usually my favorite question. I'm really looking forward to your answer, actually. It's called Leadership Heroes. So if you had to pick one person, and they could be anyone you like, alive or dead, past or present, real or fictitious even, who in your opinion would perfectly embody leadership, who would that person be and why?
That's a really challenging question, because I could probably think of 5 or 6 different people. But the one that I'll say is, I'll say General Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower. I've read a number of his books recently. I think he was just an incredibly brilliant man. I think he was humble enough as a leader to be able to learn from some really other good leaders like General Marshall and others. I think as I look at his time during World War II and in the years preceding the war, how he was able to kind of establish his reputation as somebody who was a compassionate leader, but also very driven, very capable, and how he balanced each of those facets of his personality to become the leader he was. And then in his time after World War II in the White House, as the president, how he was able to interact with the staff, interact with, the massive bureaucracy of the government to be, effective as a leader. And then in his time post presidency, when he retired, how he continued to kind of be a resource, for many people, presidents and otherwise, in being able to offer, very sound advice. So Eisenhower is one of my heroes. So, that would be my answer.
And it's a good answer, I have to say. I don't think anyone's picked him before either. I'll have to check. I'm pretty sure no one has. I'm slightly biased though, because 2 of my favorite leadership quotes ever were from Mr. Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower. The one about beating people around the head and not being leadership is that one always sticks out, definitely. Anyway, so thank you for your time today. It's been great meeting you. I've really enjoyed our conversation. The last thing I'll ask you is if any of the listeners would like to get in touch or learn more about you, is there a website that you'd like to point them towards?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. So just look me up on LinkedIn. I've got a pretty consistent feed going there, and I love to just meet new people and learn about people that are out there. So LinkedIn is the best place to find me.
Perfect. And I will find your profile link and pop it in the show notes so I can find it easily. Well, that's it then. Thank you again so much, Anthony. It's been great meeting you.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you once again, Anthony. Really enjoyed that conversation. It was an absolute privilege to meet you and get the opportunity to have that chat. I certainly learned quite a lot of things there about military life and how it can compare to the private sector. Listener, I hope that was valuable for you as well. If you would like to learn more about what Anthony gets up to, perhaps reach out to him if you're looking for a leadership coach. His LinkedIn profile link is in the episode description, so click on that now, go and drop him a message. I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. Thank you for listening today. It's appreciated as always. If you found today's episode interesting and entertaining, please do leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever it is that you are hearing my voice right now. Every review, every thumbs up, every rating, every star is much appreciated. Thank you in advance, or thank you if you've already done it. Make sure you pay a visit to www.leadernotaboss.com. Sign up today. Join us at the Integrity Leaders community. We'd love to have you. And again, that link is in the episode description, as is my LinkedIn profile. If you want to have a chat before you sign up for anything, I'm always very happy to hear from any podcast listener. So please do reach out. I'll be back next week. And for anyone who isn't aware, it is International Women's Day next week. So to honour the occasion for the rest of March, I will only be interviewing leaders who are women. So to kick us off on that, next week, I will be joined by Angela Burgess, all about her experiences in the finance world and then moving into the non-profit world. So she has some really interesting and unique insights to share about that transition, but also about how non-profits need to be led and all the various lessons that she's drawn from that in her career. So it's going to be an interesting one. I hope you'll be there. And until then, have a great rest of your week and be a leader, not a boss.